Hello, everyone. My name is Azim Khan. I'm a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive, a former lecturer of Pakistan South Asian history, and also South Asian Studies graduate. It is my pleasure to be your host today. Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 62 of hosting esteemed guests for this series, which will continue till August 17th. Today, we will be speaking to Subhasri Ghosh. Let me give you a brief bio. Subhasri Ghosh received her PhD in modern history from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Subsequently, she was engaged as a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Calcutta. She is now engaged as an assistant professor at the Department of History at Asutosh College, affiliated with the University of Calcutta. Her research interests include forced migration and gender in South Asia. How are you, Subhasri?
Yeah, thank you, Azim, for the lovely introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of this session, and I'm very thankful to the 1947 Partition Archive for giving me an opportunity, and especially to Gunita for inviting me to have this session. So it's definitely an honor and privilege, and thank you, Azim, for hosting me today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure and a privilege. So I'll dive right into the questions. Since it's a micro podcast. So, firstly, how did your interest in partition studies start, and was the connection personal or professional, or both?
uh, uh, to begin with, let me give you a disclaimer in the sense that I do not, very strictly speaking, come from a family. Like neither of my parents, like my father or my mother's side of the family, neither of them actually migrated after 1947. So generally, we have this popular perception that scholars and academicians with a history of who have a family history of migration, like they become interested in exploring deep into this migration history. But for me, it was not actually the case. But the thing is that although my parents or their families, my forefathers, they did not strictly cross the border after 1947, but the thing is that uh, my paternal grandfather, he actually hails from a village which after 1947 on the Indian side became a so-called, what can be called, a border village. That is, even now, if I go to my ancestral village, it is the BSF, the Border Security Force, who are there actually at the borders. So it is essentially, if we see, it is essentially a border village. My mother's side actually came from Faridpur, which is in present day Bangladesh. But my maternal grandfather, he also had settled down in Calcutta long before 1947. But even then, I became interested in this history because right from my childhood, I had actually been familiar with Bangladesh or East Bengal. It was East Bengal and East Pakistan at that point, because my paternal grandfather, he was a civil servant, as a result of which he had a transferable job. And my father was actually born in East Bengal, in present day Bangladesh, whereas and he also studied for a few years. His initial schooling was also in East Bengal. So my father, he actually had very fond memories of his childhood in East Bengal, which he continuously shared with us. While my mother's side of the family, although they had settled down in Calcutta for quite some time, but at the same time, they still retained their roots of East Bengal, and they actually spoke that East Bengal dialect. Although the mother tongue was the same, but there was a difference in that dialect. So, as a result of which, I was familiar with this East Bengal thing, for that matter. Although, strictly speaking, none of my parents were migrants, none of my forefathers were migrants, but I was actually familiar with these two sets of cultures among the Bengalis, the dialect, the food habits, and all. taking a humorous dig at each other, like people from West Bengal and East Bengal. So I was somewhat familiar with this right from my childhood, and it stayed in my subconscious mind. So when it started off as an academic exercise, definitely, when I got my admission at JNU in 1999, around 2 decades back. So when I had to choose a topic for my dissertation, this was something which was definitely, in that sense, there was a personal angle to it, although it started off more as an academic exercise, more as a professional exercise, so to say.
This is very fascinating. Thank you for that. Also, you've done your research on forced migration and refugees in West Bengal. I read some of your works before the interview, and I was very fascinated by this particular detail that you mentioned. And you said that before the 90s, um, partition was studied as through government and official records and government narrative. It's only the people who lived through partition, their stories only started to be given more precedence after the 90s. And of course, as you know, at the archive, our work is all about going directly to the people and asking them for their experiences. So, will you please tell us about your work with regards to this in West Bengal and your work with refugees who had previously been mostly unheard from in general consciousness?
Basically, when I started off my research, I focused mainly on West Bengal because this was definitely a familiar terrain for me. So it would have been easy for me to gain access, specifically since during a research, and especially when you are aiming for a degree, you have to fulfill certain parameters, you have to fulfill certain eligibility criteria, and at the same time, you have to work within a specific time frame. You have to submit your dissertation within a specific time frame in order to get the degree. So essentially, so that's why I focused on West Bengal, because I was familiar with the language, I had access to sources, I had access to the resources and all. So initially, I focused mainly on Calcutta because it was easy for me to come down from Delhi and do my research, since I'm based in Calcutta, so do my research and go back. But later on, I actually started to branch out to the districts, because Calcutta definitely is a very heavily explored area. People have already worked on Calcutta extensively. So I was more interested in the districts, and districts which are not actually surrounding Calcutta, but districts which are located away from Calcutta, more towards the border. So I was more interested in exploring the history of those districts, how the entire demographic contours, the entire complexion of those district changes after 1947. So that is why I focused on a particular district later on, which is called Nodia, which is actually again a truncated district after 1947. The district was split up into two after 1947. One portion going over to East Pakistan, another portion, the major portion of the district shifting to India. So I actually carried on extensive field work there in that particular district, and it was essentially the agrarian community who actually settled down in those districts. And I was exploring the caste, the class, caste, and the community angle, the relationship between the refugees as well as the host population of that district, who were mainly the Muslims at that point. So the frequent clashes between the refugees, these agrarian communities, as well as the local Muslims over land, over the resources, how the government tackled those problems, what was the role of especially the government at the grassroots level. So I was more keen on exploring those, and I talked to the people. I went to the colonies, what are called, those settlements are essentially called the colonies. So I interacted with the people of those colonies, not of course only exclusively with women, but also with men, women, even with the children. And it actually gave a new perspective. Like, we are more familiar with studies surrounding the urban center of Calcutta and all, but when you shift away from Calcutta, it gives an all new perspective, an all new dimension to partition history. And that is where this human history of partition actually actually comes up, because you are moving away from those government documents, from those archival documents, and you are focusing more on, rather than those archival documents. Of course, archival documents are important. This is not to take away the importance of these archival documents, but when you talk to the people, when you listen to their experiences, when you hear their life stories, it definitely it gives a whole new dimension. It opens up newer avenues to explore, and that is what actually comes out when you talk to these people. And that is what actually from the 1990s, if we see, especially after Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin, the human dimension of partition, that actually has added up to this partition historiography. And I also actually tried to explore that angle during my research.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I recently went and did some interviews in the villages of Miyawali, and I also found that when I was interviewing the people who were in the villages during partition, it was a completely different event for them. It was a completely different story for them. Some of them didn't even have a clue about partition when it happened. I asked them, and they were like, "Well, we didn't know. 14th August, it was just another day. We had no clue what was happening." So, I mean, in cities, for us, it's an all-encompassing event, the partition. It was very jarring, very different, fascinating to hear the villagers and their experience was completely different from us.
Yeah, and when
So could
you
you
talk to
also,
these
yeah.
people, if you say the word partition, like not actually the word partition, because since I was talking to them in their mother tongue, but when you if even if you translate partition, they will not follow that particular term. You have to tell them, like Hindustan, when Hindustan Pakistan was created, if you say those two words, Hindustan Pakistan, then they will be able to follow. If you say partition, they will not be able to understand that particular term, because for them, like it is not very clear in their psyche. You will have to say, when Hindustan Pakistan were created, what is your experience, what did you see, what did you hear, and all. So but here in Calcutta, if you say partition, anybody who doesn't understand English is also familiar with the term partition. But when you travel outside of Calcutta, you will see that these terms like partition and all, these are not actually very familiar terms. You have to be very specific, like when Pakistan was created, when Hindustan Pakistan was created. So you have to be very specific. So you have these subtle nuances when these things come out, when you travel to the district, when you talk to the so-called ordinary people. These things, actually, these are very little things which are not actually a part of our academic exercise, but these are the things that you encounter, come across when you travel to the districts and speak to the people.
Yeah, exactly. And the word, when I said Taksim or partition, they had no clue. All they understood partition as was loti. So for them, partition was just an event where a lot of looting happened.
Yeah.
Like you said, they just can't. It's very fascinating the way we differ from them here. So moving on, please tell us some of your findings on your work on gender and partition.
Yeah, when I was looking at the women specifically, so to say, there are actually in West Bengal, there are still the refugee camps where only the women are housed. So those refugee camps, these are essentially called permanent liability camps, because and as the very name suggests, permanent liability essentially means women uh, who do not have, because we live in a patriarchal society, so our mindset is very patriarchal. So women who do not have any male member to look after them, so those women are labeled as permanent liabilities, and they are considered the permanent liabilities of the government. So there are 9 such camps here in West Bengal, still here in West Bengal. The West Bengal government still has a refugee rehabilitation department. It is a full-fledged department within the ministry in West Bengal, and it is this rehabilitation department. It actually maintains these permanent liability camps, and I have visited these camps. I've talked to women, and not necessarily all of them are first generation migrants. There are actually women who are second generation migrants also, like their mothers. They came with their mothers, and they are still, like, their mothers have passed away, but they are still, since they do not have a male member to look after them, either they are widowed or they are not married, and since they do not have a stable income, so they are allowed to stay in those camps. But what actually comes across when you talk to these women, one thing is that they do have the urge to stand up on their own feet. They do have the urge to learn a vocation and earn their livelihood. But unfortunately, no such concrete action has been taken on part of the government, which would actually allow them to be financially or economically independent. So that is one thing. That is one is very tragic about, because for them, like, the agony, the trauma and the agony, it still continues. It still filters down across generations. And the other thing is, even if you talk to the first generation migrants, like, they are very aged. Some of them are over 90 years. But even then, like, they still now crave for rehabilitation, and rehabilitation for them essentially means to have a home. And they actually distinguish between a house and a home. House is something which is built of cement and brick, which is, but home is something which you associate with love, care, warmth, affection. So they still crave for that home, and that is why they are still very eager to have rehabilitation. They still pressurize the government. Actually, they not pressurize, but they actually request the government to offer them some sort of rehabilitation facilities, like in terms of money or something, which would allow them to build a home of their own, although they do not have anybody to look after them. So if they are not inside the camp, if they move out of the camp, there would be no one to take care of them. But still, that urge to have a roof over their head, this urge to call a place home, that is something which is very much, I talked to a 92-year-old lady. She is sick and emaciated. Literally, she is counting her days. But even then, this urge, her last wish is to have a home of her own. So that is something, when you talk to these people, that trauma, the agony, actually, you start to internalize those trauma, those agony. It's not an exercise between, a researcher and a interviewer and an interviewee. Somewhere the line gets blurred between an interviewer and an interviewee, and it's like, it's more of a personal experience. It's traumatizing for you also when you listen to these stories, and when you feel the angst, the trauma, the angst, which are very palpable, which are very real. So you also, at one point, at some point, when I was doing my thesis and all, when I was in the process of writing my dissertation and all, so sometimes I wondered about that why am I doing this? Like, I am benefiting from these interviews, but what are these people getting in return? I am getting a degree at their cost. I mean, at the cost of their trauma, their agony. So these are, there's such ethical questions also come to your mind when you talk to people. So it's a myriad experience. It's an experience. It's really, it's very difficult to articulate those experiences in words, basically.
So why are these refugees still unhoused, or as you said, why do they still not have a home?
It's because, like, the government singled them out, these families, because these women, they actually came without a male guardian, so to say. So they had young children. So as a result of which, the government actually took up the responsibility of looking after them. When they also had a male child with them. But when these male children, when they attained the age of 18, they were eligible for rehabilitation. So they had to move out. When a male child, he attains the age of 18, he was no longer allowed to stay in the camp. So he had to move outside. But his mother, and if he had sisters also, so they were actually cooped up in the camp. So that was actually the policy of the government, because the male children, they were not also not always financially very independent to look after the entire family. So, and the government felt that if the entire family was moved out after this male children, they attained the age of 18, so it might so happen that the male children, they might, they might not look after their sisters or their mothers. They might drive them out of their homes. And also the government felt that these women, they would be safe inside the camps. At least they would be able to have 2 square meals a day. At least they would have some clothes on their body. So the government felt that instead of burdening the male children with this entire family responsibility, it would be better to keep these women within this refugee camps. And that is why they were termed as permanent liability, because they would be the permanent responsibility of the government, so to say.
Yeah, that's very different from I've interviewed people who used to live in refugee camps, but they moved out within a few years. At the most, it'd be 5 to 10 years. But yeah, this is very different to the experience here in Punjab.
Yeah,
So I also
definitely,
oh, sorry,
because
no.
this is something which is very unique, and which is in that sense very unique of West Bengal, so to say, because there are still refugee camps earmarked where there are, you have this dole system where you have a cash dole, that is some sort of a stipend is given, a cash dole, as well as a dry dole in the form of, a ration, in the form of food. And also, so this system, this is a part of the government policy, irrespective of which political party comes to power. This is a part of a structured government policy. So this has continued right from the 1950s. Like in 1950, these camps were first opened, and this has continued actually over the decades without much of a change, so to say.
Moving on, I would like to ask you about. I read another paper of yours, which was written about partition being the story of partition being told through literature, and you mentioned 3 novels. One of these novels, I'm definitely going to read it. That's the next book in my wish list. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Dayamoyir Katha.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you please explain and elaborate on the themes, because I found them to be absolutely brilliant, especially how they show the complexities of partition and everything you lose in a non-violent migration. Please elaborate on those themes.
Yeah, দয়াময়ের কথা, even actually all those partition novels that I have highlighted in that article, so those are semi-autobiographical novels. Like the protagonist, the women who were the authors of those novels, and in case of দয়াময়ের কথা also, she herself was a migrant, and she has this angst to go back and have one last look at her family, at her family, where her family was actually based. And she had actually stayed back. Basically, she had stayed back. Her parents had migrated, but she stayed back with one of her widowed aunts, this Dayamoyi, who is the protagonist of that novel. And you can very easily make out that she is the author. The Dayamoyi is actually the author. So so Dayamoyi, actually, she lived with her widowed aunt, and her widowed aunt and their man Friday was a Muslim cultivator who tilled their lands. So when her paternal aunt, her widowed paternal aunt, finally took the decision to migrate, because it was no longer safe for a woman and a child to stay back in East Bengal, and the rest of the family had already shifted to Calcutta, and they were urging the paternal aunt and Dayamoyi to shift to to migrate to Calcutta. So when her aunt took the final decision, actually, so Doyamoi, she could not actually figure out why was suddenly this cultivator, this gentleman named Mazam. So why suddenly would her aunt prevent her from having that speaking with that Mazam? So what changed actually for Doyama? It's difficult to figure out what actually changed. And she was like, when the author, she was writing, she was trying to actually figure out, she was trying to look at things from the perspective of a 7-8-year-old child. She was trying to look at partition from the viewpoint of a 7 to 8-year-old child, and trying to fathom what has actually changed after after August 1947. What has actually changed, and why did it change? And that is what she has through all those anecdotes. She was rewinding to the period post August 1947 and pre-August 1947. They were a respectable family in the village, and there was no religious distinction between the communities. So why did things change? So these are the questions that is throughout the novel. If you see, these are the questions that she was trying to figure out, that everything has remained the same. The water, the air, the soil, nothing has changed. But then why should relationship between people, why should relationship between neighbors change? So that is the larger question that she was actually trying to figure out through her novels. And when she went back in order to visit her, which is still called her ancestral homeland, she was in a sense disillusioned, because everything has changed, in the sense that topography has changed, the very geography has changed. So in that sense, she was disillusioned. And but even then, that that pull of that soil, that still remained to her. And I mean, that has not changed, although the physical topography has changed. So she was trying to actually look at those larger question of why has things changed, and what actually has changed. I mean, within a space of a few days, how can things actually radically change, that you will be uprooted from your homeland and need to transplant to a completely alien setup? So that is what she was trying to actually look at through this novel.
Yeah, I think my favorite part was where she's not allowed to go to the houses where she used to go, and the juxtaposition of, like, there's this hard partition which is between Bengal is divided into two, as the rest of India, but her, where she is in East Bengal, that's not partition. They're still on the same side, but then there's this soft invisible partition that even though she's in East Bengal, there's a partition between her and the Muslims, like her favorite gardener, who was a favorite person in the world outside her mother, and that was brilliantly the dichotomies of partition, the incongruencies of partition was told so brilliantly through just this single fact. So just
Yeah,
one
it
final.
creates partition of the mind. It's like partition of the mind. Although you cannot see, I mean, you cannot physically see the line itself, the Radcliffe line, but it creates partition of the mind, partition between neighbors, partition between people. So that is what the novel talks about. The many partitions, just one divider on the soil, and that created so many partitions amongst people. So that is the tragedy of partition, and that is the legacy, perhaps, which we still carry forward in a sense, if you see.
Definitely. And thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Subhasri, and for this insight into the partition of East Bengal and West Bengal, and especially giving insight into the refugees and the people in the rural areas. And thank you for introducing me to these Bengali novels that I am definitely going to read. I think they'll go alongside Mantra and partition literature. Um, and thank you for all those who are joining us. Go on, please.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really it was really enriching for me to have this interaction, and the brilliant work that you have been doing. And of course, in the future, I look forward in the future to hearing more of your stories, listening to those life stories. These are definitely not as an academic exercise, but more as to in order to learn the human experience of partition. So this is something which is not actually anybody can identify with these stories. It is not something which always has an academic rigor, but anybody can listen to those stories and learn so much and unlearn so much also. It is not only about learning but also unlearning a lot of things. So this is an exercise, I think, which we should always continue forward. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was our pleasure. And for those of you who are joining us, please tune in tomorrow for another amazing conversation. The 1927 Partition Archive is hosting this series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd, 2022 and August 17th, 2020, except Sundays, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition. The series will entail live conversation bursts with historians, filmmakers, authors, art makers, and other practitioners working on uncovering and understanding the history of partition. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan, 25 days after the Partition Plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you very much again, and please show us your love and support by sending hearts and light. Thank you.